What if I told you that during World War II, there was a facility so secret, so horrific, that even Auschwitz survivors could scarcely imagine it? A place where doctors froze newborn babies alive, vivisected pregnant women without anesthesia, and unleashed plagues on entire cities. Between 1936 and 1945, over 200,000 souls were slaughtered in the name of science. Yet the masterminds behind these crimes never faced justice. Shielded by a U.S. cover-up, they lived freely, their victims forgotten. This is the buried truth of Unit 731, Japan's darkest secret. The story of Unit 731 begins not with a building, but with a man. Shiro Ishii, born in 1892 in Japan's Chiba prefecture, was the son of a wealthy landowner. Privilege surrounded him, but so did arrogance. From his earliest years, he was described as brilliant, ambitious, and disturbingly lacking in empathy. At Kyoto Imperial University, he studied medicine and specialized in microbiology. Professors and classmates admired his intellect but were unsettled by his ruthlessness. He saw life not as sacred, but as a puzzle to be solved or destroyed if it served his purpose. In 1925, when the Geneva Protocol outlawed chemical and biological weapons, most of the world saw a step toward civilized warfare. Ishii saw an opportunity. If nations feared these weapons enough to ban them, then in his mind, they must be devastatingly effective. He began lobbying the Imperial Japanese Army, arguing that bacteria could serve as weapons of mass destruction, cheaper and more powerful than bombs or tanks. His charisma and sheer force of will convinced military leaders to indulge him. Ishii's real genius wasn't just science, it was manipulation. He didn't recruit sadists or criminals for his program. Instead, he sought out Japan's brightest doctors and researchers, offering them lavish salaries, state-of-the-art laboratories, and the prestige of working for the emperor. Those who resisted were branded traitors, hikumen, an accusation that could destroy reputations or even lives. Under his influence, Japan's most promising medical professionals became willing accomplices in horrors that would stain history. When his team assembled, Ishii addressed them with chilling honesty. "A doctor's mission is to block disease and save lives," he declared, "but our research will do the opposite. We will create diseases, spread them, and use them as weapons." He promised both scientific breakthroughs and military glory. In that speech lay the foundation for the greatest program of human experimentation ever conducted, a vision that would soon take root in occupied Manchuria. The opportunity for Ishii's vision came with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The Mukden Incident, a staged attack on Japan's own railway, provided the excuse for occupation. Out of this false flag operation came Manchukuo, a puppet state where the imperial army ruled with unchecked authority. For Ishii, it was the perfect laboratory, far from international eyes, under absolute military control. Populated by civilians the Japanese elite deemed racially inferior and expendable. In 1932, Ishii established his first experimental base at Jongma Fortress, a prison laboratory disguised as a medical research center. Prisoners included political dissidents, peasants accused of fabricated crimes, captured partisans, and anyone unlucky enough to be targeted by the dreaded Kempeitai military police. At first, captives were fed well, even given meat and alcohol. This wasn't compassion, it was methodology. Ishii wanted test subjects in peak health so his experiments would yield accurate data. Inside Jongma, the horrors began. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague and cholera. Others were drained of blood over weeks, starved or deprived of water to measure how long a body could survive. Some were cut open alive in crude surgical trials. Ishii's researchers meticulously recorded every detail: pulse rates, organ failure, time of death. The camp was a perverse parody of medicine, where every principle of healing was inverted. But secrecy was fragile. In 1934, a mass escape of 40 prisoners exposed the project. All escapees were hunted down and killed, yet whispers spread. A year later, a mysterious explosion, possibly sabotage, damaged the facility. Rather than abandon his vision, Ishii exploited the incidents, claiming they proved the need for something larger, more secure, and more advanced. Out of this demand came his true masterpiece, the the Pingfang complex, a city of death that would rival Auschwitz in scale and eclipse it in cruelty. By 1935, Shiro Ishii had convinced the Japanese military that his vision demanded more than a fortress. It required an entire city. That year, construction began on what would become the infamous Pingfang complex, located 24 kilometers south of Harbin, in occupied Manchuria. On the surface, it was presented to locals as a lumber mill, but behind its walls lay something far more sinister. Covering 6 square kilometers, the site included more than 150 buildings, surrounded by a 3-meter-high brick wall, a dry moat lined with electrified wire, and checkpoints guarded by soldiers. It was a fortress disguised as science, impregnable to outside eyes. Within its boundaries stood everything Ishii needed to industrialize death: state-of-the-art laboratories, prison blocks, crematoriums, workshops, chemical plants, an airport, and even rail connections for transporting prisoners and supplies. The scale of the complex was staggering. Pingfang contained 6 massive cauldrons for chemical production, 1,800 vessels for cultivating bacteria, and 4,500 containers for breeding plague-infected fleas. At full capacity, it could produce 300 kilograms of plague bacteria, nearly 6,000 kilograms of anthrax, 9,000 kilograms of typhoid, and 1,000 kilograms of cholera every month. This was not a laboratory. It was a factory for mass-producing death. Hidden inside were the most secretive structures of all: Buildings 7 and 8, the inner prisons. These housed men, women, and children in cells designed for experimentation. Prisoners could number in the hundreds at any given time, with iron doors and photo ID checkpoints ensuring that access was tightly controlled. Researchers nicknamed their victims Maruta, or logs, a grotesque inside joke that reduced human beings to raw material for experiments. By institutionalizing this dehumanization, Ishii ensured that atrocity became routine. Pingfang wasn't just about research. It was about efficiency. Corpses were burned in furnaces to erase evidence. Pathogens were produced in industrial batches ready for military use. Even the staff lived comfortably in modern housing, with theaters and recreation, as if working in a death camp was just another government job. Within Pingfang, murder became science, and science became industry. Pingfang was only the beginning. As Japan's war in China escalated after 1937, Ishii's model was replicated across occupied Asia. Unit 731 became the flagship of a vast biological warfare network with more than 26 known facilities and tens of thousands of personnel. Each site specialized in a different aspect of death. Unit 1644, based in Nanjing, conducted urban-focused experiments, testing how pathogens spread in crowded population. Unit 1855 in Beijing concentrated on aerial dispersal method, experimenting with how to release bacteria from planes over entire cities. In Guangzhou, Unit 8604 focused on tropical diseases, developing strains that could devastate southern climate. Unit 100 in Changchun targeted animals, engineering diseases to wipe out herds and cripple food supplies. By 1939, Ishii's empire employed over 10,000 people: scientists, doctors, soldiers, and technicians. They worked in coordinated fashion, pooling data and refining methods of destruction. This was no fringe project. It was a state-backed machine of biological warfare, supported by an annual budget equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. The secrecy was absolute. Civilians were told the facilities were mills or water treatment plants. Locals joked grimly that the lumber mill didn't produce wood, but processed logs, a dark reference to the human beings brought inside and never seen again. Within the Japanese military, however, the network was no joke. It was considered a cutting-edge weapons program, one that might tip the balance of war in their favor. This expansion also widened the pool of victims. While Chinese civilians remained the primary targets, Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, and even captured Allied prisoners of war were transported into this system. Victims were stripped of names, assigned numbers, and treated as data points in a continent-spanning program of cruelty. By the end of the 1930s, Unit 731 was no longer a single camp in Manchuria. It was an empire of laboratories stretching across Asia. It stood as the most systematic attempt in history to weaponize disease, its reach rivaling any other atrocity of World War II. Yet still, the full horror had not been unleashed. That would come with the experiments themselves, the vivisections, the frostbite trials, and the epidemics deliberately set upon unsuspecting cities. To keep Pingfang supplied with test subjects, the Japanese military police, the dreaded Kempeitai, became an integral part of the operation. Their role was to feed the human machinery of Unit 731. They prowled villages and towns in ominous black vans known as Black Ravens. Locals quickly learned to dread the sight. When a raven appeared, people vanished. Victims came from all walks of life. Some were accused criminals, others captured guerrillas or suspected partisans. Many were simply ordinary civilians rounded up on fabricated charges, chosen because they were expendable. The sweep was indiscriminate. Peasants, students, women carrying infants, the homeless, even the mentally ill. The Japanese military considered them all suitable logs for Ishii's experiments. Once seized, victims were transported at night to avoid witnesses. The black vans had ventilation holes but no windows, ensuring prisoners arrived unseen and unheard. On entering Pingfang, subjects were processed like livestock. Clerks recorded their height, weight, blood type, and organ function. Samples of urine, blood, and stool were taken. But this wasn't for treatment. It was quality control. Ishii's team wanted healthy, baseline bodies for their experiments. The healthier the prisoner, the more useful the data. At this stage, their humanity was stripped away. Names were erased, replaced with 3-digit numbers. Families left behind rarely discovered their fate. To the researchers, they were not people, only variables in grotesque experiments. Guards rotated shackles from corpse to corpse, recycling chains as if they were tools of industry. Diversity of victims was shocking. While Chinese civilians were the majority, Russians, Mongolians, Koreans, and captured Allied soldiers also passed through Pingfang's gates. Reports confirm Americans, British, and even Australians were among those dissected or infected. The breadth of this victim pool makes Unit 731 not just a crime against one people, but a crime against humanity. By the late 1930s, the Kempeitai had turned Manchuria into a living stockyard for Ishii's Death City. Villages whispered that once the ravens came, no one returned. It was terror not only by sword and gun, but by science perverted into a weapon. Ishii's empire needed fresh bodies constantly, and the machine of abduction ensured a steady flow of suffering to fuel the experiments. Inside Pingfang's walls, death was not quick. It was calculated. The most infamous practice was live vivisection, surgical dissection performed on conscious prisoners without anesthesia. Doctors in white coats, many of them respected graduates of Japan's finest universities, carried out these procedures with clinical detachment. Witness accounts reveal scenes of unimaginable horror. Prisoners, often infected with plague or cholera, were strapped to tables. As scalpels pierced their skin, their screams filled the rooms. To silence them, rags or gauze were stuffed into their mouths. Surgeons cut open torsos to observe organs as disease progressed. Hearts still beat as livers and lungs were removed. A former Unit 731 assistant confessed, "When I picked up the scalpel, the man began screaming, his face twisted in agony. I cut from chest to stomach while he was alive." Women suffered uniquely. Pregnant captives were cut open, their unborn children dissected alongside them. No child born within Unit 731 ever survived. One testimony recounts a woman begging, "Kill me, but spare my child." Her plea was ignored. Beyond vivisection, other experiments defy comprehension. Prisoners were exposed to frostbite, their limbs submerged in icy water, then beaten with sticks to test if they were frozen solid. When flesh shattered like wood, the data was noted. Victims were locked in dehydration chambers, their bodies shriveling over weeks until they weighed a fraction of their normal mass. Others were spun to death in centrifuges, suffocated in pressure chambers until their eyes burst. or burned with chemical gases in sealed rooms. What made these atrocities even darker was their systematic nature. This wasn't random cruelty. Every act was timed, measured, and documented in meticulous records. Doctors who swore oaths to heal instead became executioners in lab coats, and Ishii encouraged it all, framing the work as both a scientific breakthrough and a patriotic duty. By the time Japan's empire reached its peak, thousands of men, women, and children had been reduced to data points in ledgers. To Ishii's staff, they were maruta, logs feeding the furnace of science. To history, they are a reminder of how quickly medicine can transform into murder when stripped of morality. By the late 1930s, Ishii's laboratories had produced industrial quantities of pathogens, and the time came to test them beyond the walls of Pingfang. What followed was not science, it was biological warfare unleashed on civilian populations. Japanese aircraft began dropping plague-infected fleas across Chinese provinces. Cities like Ningbo and Changde were chosen as test sites. At first, residents simply noticed strange particles falling from the sky, bundles of rice, grain, or cotton that seemed harmless. Days later, plague swept through their neighborhoods, killing tens of thousands. Eyewitnesses described outbreaks spreading with terrifying speed. Families collapsed in their homes, villages emptied almost overnight. Even Japanese soldiers stationed nearby weren't spared. During the 1941 Changde campaign, over 1,700 of Ishii's own troops died after inadequate protection exposed them to plague. It was a bitter irony. Soldiers became victims of their own empire's cruelty. Unit 731 also experimented with other pathogens in the field. Anthrax spores poisoned crops and livestock, crippling rural economies. Typhoid and cholera were dumped into rivers and wells, infecting entire communities through contaminated water. Dysentery and glanders were also deployed, each chosen to test different conditions of spread and lethality. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that over 200,000 people died in these biological attacks, with some scholars suggesting the toll may have reached nearly 500,000. The ultimate plan, however, revealed just how far Ishii was willing to go. In 1945, as Japan faced imminent defeat, Unit 731 finalized Operation Cherry Blossoms at night. The scheme involved launching plague bombs from submarine aircraft carriers against American cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. Crews were expected to infect themselves and land ashore in suicide missions, ensuring maximum spread. If carried out, it could have created an epidemic on U.S. soil, killing countless civilians. The plan was scheduled for September 22, 1945, but Japan's surrender ended it before launch. Still, its very existence shows the apocalyptic scale of Ishii's ambitions. By the war's end, Unit 731 had proven that disease could be wielded like any bomb or bullet, but unlike conventional weapons, bacteria knew no boundaries. Once released, they could not be controlled. Ishii had shown the world the terrifying potential of biological warfare, but what came next was even more disturbing. The crimes would be buried, not punished. In August 1945, as Japan teetered on the edge of surrender, Ishii moved to erase the evidence of his crimes. At Pingfang, thousands of documents were burned, buildings destroyed, and prisoners executed. Witnesses later recalled mass killings in the final days, hundreds of captives gassed, shot, or burned alive to ensure no trace remained. Soldiers dismantled equipment and spread quicklime over remains, trying to scrub away the bloodstains of years of horror. When Allied forces entered Japan, they quickly discovered rumors of biological warfare research. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, a U.S. microbiologist, was tasked with investigating. What he uncovered hinted at atrocities beyond imagination. But instead of preparing trials like those at Nuremberg, General Douglas MacArthur made a fateful decision. He struck a deal with Ishii and his top scientists: immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research data. The justification was simple but chilling. America, now entering the Cold War, believed the Soviet Union might capture Japanese scientists and their knowledge. To prevent this, the U.S. offered protection. In reality, the data turned out to be crude, inconsistent, and of little scientific value. Yet Ishii and his men walked free. They returned to civilian life, many resuming prestigious careers in medicine, academia, and industry. Ishii himself never faced trial. He lived comfortably until his death from throat cancer in 1959, a natural death denied to the hundreds of thousands who perished under his command. Other senior officers became professors, hospital directors, even leaders in Japan's pharmaceutical industry. The system that committed mass murder simply blended back into society, their crimes erased from official history. For decades, Unit 731 remained a whispered rumor. Survivors' testimonies were ignored. The Japanese government refused acknowledgement, while American authorities kept the documents classified. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians and journalists began piecing together the truth, revealing the scale of the atrocities. In 2002, a Japanese court finally admitted Unit 731 had engaged in biological warfare, but still denied survivors compensation. The cover-up was complete. In protecting its Cold War interests, the U.S. had traded justice for data that proved worthless. The victims of Unit 731 were abandoned, their suffering dismissed, while their killers lived long, respected lives. It remains one of the darkest examples of history, not only being written by the victors, but rewritten to bury the crimes of those they chose to shield. The story of Unit 731 is not just about the crimes committed, it is about the silence that followed. Shiro Ishii and his colleagues lived out their lives as respected citizens, shielded by a secret deal that robbed victims of justice. For decades, the atrocities were hidden, survivors ignored, and documents locked away. Even today, both Japan and the United States keep many records classified, citing national interests over human dignity. Yet history has a way of surfacing. In the 1990s and early 2000s, survivors finally told their stories, demanding recognition of the horrors they endured. Courts admitted Unit 731's crimes occurred, but refused compensation. The message was clear. Truth mattered, but justice would not come. The legacy of Unit 731 stands as one of the darkest reminders of how science can be corrupted when morality is abandoned. These atrocities achieved nothing militarily, offered no meaningful data, and left only trauma. The only lesson worth preserving is a warning. When ambition and nationalism overtake humanity, even doctors, the very people sworn to heal, can become executioners.